Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 51st week of 2013. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are Karen Aram and Ron Szoke. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who has been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20 years we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, quote, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Today is December 20, the eve of the winter solstice, when the sun reaches its furthest point south on the terrestrial globe, and winter begins. That time of year thou mayst in me behold when yellow leaves, or none, or few, do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bare ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self, that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire that on the ashes of his youth doth lie as the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well, which thou must leave ere long. That's Edward de Vere's Sonnet 73, written about 1600, a man of 50, feeling his age. You're watching News from Neptune, the Winter's Eve edition, and Ron Szoke has a seasonal meditation for us.
Well, this one will be a little less serious than usual, but I thought I would say something about my personal naughty or nice list. I'm making a list and checking it twice. Maybe I should have checked it again.
Mike checked it.
Right. So I'll do the naughty list first, which is more fun. And there are three levels of that. Starting with the somewhat naughty, that is mildly sucky and annoying stuff.
These are technical terms, right?
Right. Which caused some minor pains in the neck and posterior in 2013. All the people who keep sending me requests to sign online petitions and contributions to political campaigns, about 20 to 30 every day I get, which is becoming a drag. All the people who keep posting super cute pictures of children and pets on Facebook. All the people who keep ranting against big government and its interference in our lives without telling us just what it is they're complaining about. All of the privileged and prosperous people who seem full of self-pity and keep whining about being victims of oppression and moaning about how unfair it is that they are not as rich, famous, and powerful as they want to be. They get a lemon in their stocking on Christmas morning. Very naughty. Next level, the more routine outrages. Fox News, which is the most extreme example of biased commentary in the current major media. Media research seems to show that the more people that watch Fox News watch it, the more ignorant and confused they are by the tests that they're using. Senator Cruz, whose antics as a right-wing demagogue have alienated so many, even in his own party. The gun nuts who oppose every attempt to restrict and control the availability of death-dealing firearms everywhere. The members of the Supreme Court, whose decisions have done so much to turn the USA into a blatant plutocracy. And finally, politicians and evangelists who exploit people's ignorance, fears, and gullibility. They get a lump of coal in their stocking. Finally, the Monty Python range, for which I use their immortal statement, "You make me puke." The sole inhabitants here are Rush Limbaugh and Ann Coulter, whose crypto-fascist statements mark them as buffoons who stay in the news by emitting ever more vicious insults and absurd accusations. They get a lump of poop in their stocking. So, shall we go on to the nice?
Please do. Please. Yes, please do.
Okay, somewhat nice. Cool persons, thanks to those who have said or done some good things in 2013. Julian Assange for revealing on WikiLeaks some of the aspects of America's dirty war in the Middle East. The U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation, J Street, Jewish Force for Peace, Just Foreign Policy, and related organizations trying to obtain justice for the Palestinians. My neighbors who show up with shovels and snow blowers on appropriate days. Garrison Keillor for some wise and witty commentary on Prairie Home Companion. Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert for their satire, parodies, and sarcasm, usually in the right direction. Senator Elizabeth Warren for her stands on protecting middle-class finances. Amy Goodman and Tom Hartman, who every weekday morning on UPTV supply some much-needed corrections to the Murdoch Ailes hoaxes on Fox News. And the entire staff of UPTV for all they do to make this show possible. They deserve a walnut or two in their stockings.
Hear, hear.
Very nice. Next level. Congratulations and best wishes to Pope Francis for his apparent attempt to prevent the Catholic Church from degenerating into a murderous anti-abortion cult. Chelsea Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden for blowing the whistle on government secrecy and deception. Senator Bernie Sanders and journalist Bill Moyers for their continuing opposition to the impending plutocracy. Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz, two economists who have been warning us about the consequences of the ever greater inequality of wealth in this country. Claudia and everyone at Champaign County Healthcare Consumers for helping people get affordable health care. They get an orange and an apple in their stocking. Finally, beautiful person level. Happy every day and blessed New Year to, above all, to my wife, Rebecca, who tolerates my grouchiness every morning. So maybe she'll get something electronic in her stocking. Who knows? I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ron. Karen, you have a take on some of Ron's naughty and nice friends here?
I can't imagine why he'd even want to watch Fox for any reason. I mean, I attempted once or twice when I first returned to the U.S., and I decided that no, the ulcers aren't worth it.
Well, I think one of the best reasons to watch it, I actually think there is a reason to watch it, and I must admit I find it hard to do too. But the reason to watch it is that it is a concentrated attempt by neoliberal interests in the United States, what we call the 1%, to construct a popular understanding of politics that goes in their direction. And particularly on this show, where our remit is to consider the news of the week and its coverage by the media, we should consider that coverage. I think, in fact, that while we're deconstructing Fox account as much as we can, we should also turn our attention to MSNBC and its clones, certainly CNN as well, which in some ways are doing the same thing in a less obvious fashion. I mean, it's sort of like praising Cruz as a politician is really worthwhile when politicians are obviously crude, stupid, and finally corrupt. That's better than those that are smooth, careful, and personally unassailable in their conduct. The sort of Barack Obama style, who is not the lesser evil, as Glenn Ford points out, in comparison to his Republican rival in the last election, but rather the more effective evil. And it seems to me that when it comes to media, MSNBC is in fact the more effective evil than Fox, because we can make fun of Fox, as indeed we should.
Yeah. And actually, Carl, that's exactly what I was going to say, is that twice I tried to watch Fox and just couldn't. Because I do not consider it liberal in any respect, or neoliberal. I consider it to be ultra-conservative, knowing Mr. Murdoch. What I did then was, of course, I would always watch CNN, because I watched CNN International. But I watched it deteriorate significantly. In its trying to compete with Fox ratings.
Well,
and
I
mean, here again, it's for profit, and they failed miserably. But I found I cannot stomach CNN anymore because of the trivia. So of course I was excited during the elections in 2009 with some of the commentators on MSNBC, and I felt that it was definitely a step up above CNN. However, I've had 4 years now, and other than I do enjoy watching Chris Hayes sometimes, I find even Melissa Harris Perry catering too much to Obama politics. Anyway, I've just given up on MSNBC, and the only thing I can watch now that's newsworthy is Democracy Now! And Tom Hartman on UTV, so on UPTV. So. And like most people today, I think I have to get my news either from, even PBS is very much the standard bearer for what is there. In fact, I find, I think your assessment of MSNBC, and during the elections, I thought, well, we're getting a counter view of what's going on, but it became so obvious that they just have to support Democrats and Obama, no matter what. So where is the real openness? And it doesn't exist.
Only on UPTV.
TV. Yeah, really, truly. Yeah, but I like most people now, I get my news from the internet and from the articles that I read. But I also I say Democracy Now! And Tom Hartman, I forget to mention Aware and News from Neptune, which I've always pointed out I didn't really watch News from Neptune, I'm sorry to say, until I was on it. But Aware really did enlighten me significantly, and made me feel good about moving to a community where you exist and where you supported what I was beginning to see with your ideas. So
we might mention too our friend David Johnson, who does the Labor Hour does the Labor Show here on UPTV on Sundays, and on radio station WEFT retains the one of the few. Seems to me politically reasonable programs that one can hear on local radio, and he does that, or he and his colleagues do that every Saturday morning at 11 o'clock, and that should be recommended too.
You're absolutely right. Yeah.
There's a certain discipline involved in listening to these people who otherwise, activate your gag reflex. Trying to figure out what it is they want, what are they up to, what's bugging them, and it's mostly, what they say is mostly bluffing and faking, I'm convinced, but there's something they're saying that is appealing to a lot of people, and can you figure out what it is? Their constant appeals, for example, to fear, to greed, and to hatred, and can we elaborate some more plausible alternative to that would turn people away from the kind of program they seem to be advocating? And I don't know, it's difficult.
One of the things Well, actually, I was going to comment on just that after reading some of what I have here about Asia and the parallels that I draw from that to exactly what you're talking about now. So I'll just go ahead and say, I think one of the things they do, because I'll brief through the station, CNN, and then I'll go to MSNBC to see what they're focused on. And like, has anything happened that I missed online? And most of the time what I see is a focus on what I call the individual, the private, and the personal. They will focus on one individual being murdered or raped or abused or he said, she said. It's constant that makes people stay in what I call this microcosm and not look out beyond our borders or look up to the government. And I think this is one of the problems with society. If they keep you in your own little world so what they're doing is they want people to relate. They will talk about situations that they think the average viewer can relate to. And I think this is normal. It's whether we're watching television, whether we're reading books, whether we're going to movies. We always want to relate to a character, or we want to relate to someone. and that's what I'm going to actually bring up here when I do this book review. As to, I think that we go through a process, and I think when children, I think it's natural, children will read books about individuals that perhaps they can relate to. Often when they're very young, it's animals. And then we have to outgrow that. At some point, we have to outgrow that, and we have to begin to relate to that which is beyond just the self. That's kind of my thinking on it. But I don't want to withdraw from what Ron was.
No, well, I think that's right. There's this tendency in a lot of the popular media to personalize and psychologize and subjectivize everything and immediately sort out good people versus bad people,
right.
Who's in the white hats, who's in the black hats, and this constant appeal to indignation and the moralizing and so on before they've really begun to show me that they understand anything that's going on. But
I think we should. I think perhaps we should focus on why this is done, what it is this way. Remember, the mainstream media in this country are owned by rich people. All the news business is not just people like the owner of Amazon buying the Washington Post, which has been the CIA's favorite newspaper for many years. These things are given. I'm talking more about the electronic media, where the ownership is in the hands of the largest corporations some of the largest corporations in the country. Okay, what are they doing with what they own? What they're doing is, I think, perhaps best described as damage control. What they're doing is trying to find a way, in the interests of that 1%, represents their ownership, to handle the biggest threat that the 1% has in this country right now. The biggest threat is unrest among the American populace. The American populace understanding why are there no jobs? Why are my situations so bad? Why have my wages been flat for 40 years? Why am I living so badly in an economy in the richest nation in the world, where in fact the people at the top are getting rich beyond the dreams of avarice, and indeed even since the financial crisis of 2007 and 8 have immensely increased their share of the national wealth, and that transfer of wealth from the majority to the tiny minority continues apace, and indeed it's accelerating. Now that's a situation in which you would expect the majority to finally say, look, there's something wrong with this. We've got to turn this around. Wealth has got to flow the other way. We've got to make jobs. We've got to make the sorts of things that will allow people to feed their families and stay in their homes, not have their mortgages foreclosed on, etc. Now, how do you make sure that people don't begin to insist on those things which are not in the interest of the 1%? You tell them that they have enemies who are doing this to them, and those enemies need to be dealt with. And so you get the sort of stories that Ron was just talking about how underclasses are taking away the things that they might have by cheating on welfare programs. So you're getting immigrants are taking jobs that they might otherwise have. There are people out there doing this to you, and indeed, if you listen to the news tonight, we'll tell you the stories about how those people are doing it. One of the system generalizes because one of the villains that they point you to is another one on Ron's list of the Szoke list, I think, big government. They say, you know, big government is doing this to you. Obamacare is doing this to you. It's taking away all this sorts of thing. Now, the point of that is, of course, that the one instrument that the people at large might use to counter the confiscation of their lifestyles by the 1%, the one instrument they might use is government. Your praise for Elizabeth Warren, I think, suggests that she has just slightly, just gently said, you know, look, we can do things like this, you know. She hasn't been going very far on it, but the mere fact it's been suggested at all is what should be noticed. Now, once you do that, once you begin to give people the idea that government can be the solution of these problems, that we could have single-payer health care, we could have support for people who are behind, whose mortgages are underwater, that we could have a jobs program like the WPA and the Depression and so forth, people will begin to say, okay, let's have a government that does this. Now, the Obama administration glommed on to some of that and pretended that it was going to do some of those things, or Obama himself did in the presidential elections, and people voted for him in part because they thought government would be used to ameliorate their condition. Well, of course, you've got to be told why that's not possible, while big government is the enemy, and why you know, these things aren't being done because, of course, there are enemies out there who are destroying your life. That's the mainstream media's job. It's a damage control by the 1%. They do pretty well.
Well, I would add Senator Bernie Sanders to Elizabeth Warren as someone who's trying to do good things, but of course.
Yeah, and once again, the situation is constrained enough that the examples we use of people who are trying to do good things are extremely limited.
Yes.
Bernie Sanders has a very bad record on environmental issues, for example. Elizabeth Warren supports the war in the Middle East. I mean, now the fact I'm not denying that they have occasionally said some good things about tax, but what it's the dog in the night, you know, and what is remarkable is how little is necessary for them to say for them to say to get noticed on this.
Yeah. Well, in order to divert people, I think there's this big emphasis upon individual acts of questionable character, sex scandals,
oh goodness, yes.
entertainment, all this talk about when one starlet says something, slams another one, and so on. This is big news.
Yeah.
When the duck guy.
Right. That's what I got this morning. Yes. I had
says,
no idea.
Said something racist or anti-gay or so on, and then gets suspended by the network for that. This causes an enormous furor, of invading his freedom of speech. And that's not involved at all.
Right.
It plays into the identity politics, which of course is the other way in which principal way in which liberal politics are corrupted in our generation. You know, so when become issues, the issues become questions of group solidarity. Black people, women, whatever, and even the poor are taken to be another identity class. You know, not a result of the economic system that destroys the majority for the benefit of the minority. There's not a solution here, but an aspect of this problem that I think is worthwhile. Read the financial press. I would argue, we were talking about this before the show, that probably the leading newspaper, English language newspaper in the world these days is the Financial Times. It's published in London. The Financial Times, sometimes compared to the Wall Street Journal, but since the Murdoch interest bought the Wall Street Journal, the Wall Street Journal is closer to what we were talking about a moment ago than it is to the Financial Times now. We do have a tradition of a business press in the U.S. and the U.K. and so forth, in which people who are actually engaged in extracting the wealth of the majority and moving it to the minority have to know what's going on accurately, rather than through this fog of identity politics and personal stories of things Ron's been talking about. And you can find that, as I say, better in the financial press than you can elsewhere, with the Financial Times being at the top of the list. Now, I'm not suggesting that the political positions the Financial Times takes, particularly in its editorial comments, are anything to be praised, but they're not stupid and mystified in the way that so much of the rest of mainstream media are. So, you know, there's a little praise for the financial press, and it's something that's, you know, the old man in the British Museum would have understood very well. He would have read it that way, too.
Yeah. Well, there's an old journalistic cliche, if it bleeds, it leads. And what does that mean? Something sensational, something that people think they can relate to. Bad people doing bad things to good people, and so on.
Exactly.
And they view themselves, of course, as victims of big government or whatever. But it's amazing the extent to which people can be misled and deluded by this kind of stuff.
Right.
It's the reason that your list included, and on the good side, WikiLeaks. I think we're still only slowly coming to realize how important, how vitally important, what Julian Assange and the WikiLeaks people did, and how it ramifies through so much of our politics right now, and how the bravery of Mr. Snowden continues to be one of the few checks on the system that is producing such misery around the world, economic and military.
Yeah, more stuff came out this morning online about the extent of NSA spying on foreign leaders, including the Prime Minister of Israel. We'll see how that one plays. But yeah, it's been going on for years, and we owe an enormous debt to Edward Snowden, who was a real American hero, for getting this stuff out, so we can react to the secrecy and misrepresentation of the government.
There's somebody else, another media figure on your list I want to praise, Ron. That's Rush Limbaugh. What Rush did is not quite the same as what Julian Assange did, of course. But you know, it wasn't. It's important to see that the things that he did right, he didn't do right by accident. What I'm referring to particularly is Rush Limbaugh's comments on the Pope's attack on capitalism. He saw accurately what the point that, and said, made the point that all other commentators, particularly often religious commentators, missed or wanted to obfuscate. That is, that the Pope was attacking capitalism. And that's what Rush meant, of course, by Marxist. I mean, Marxist is a strange word, as we know, as a result of the Cold War and whatnot. It means different things to different people, everything from a theological position to an analysis of capitalism to a prediction of a beautiful socialist future to a Stalinist, repressive, right-wing regime. So we should be careful when we use the term Marxist to specify what Marxism we have in mind.
I would say the same thing, Carl, about liberal and neoliberal. It means different things to different people.
Well, left.
And therefore it's worthwhile when we use them to specify what we mean by them. But my point here is that if we pay attention to that, when Rush said the Pope is speaking Marxism, and everybody said, oh, well, come on, Rush, the Pope isn't speaking Marxism, Rush was right. Because what the Pope was talking about was the analysis of capitalism, how capitalism worked. And Marxism, in one of its meanings, and perhaps its basic meaning, refers to the analysis of capital. Has nothing to do with socialism, has nothing to do with government repression. Marxism is finally an attempt to try to understand the secret workings of capitalism. Capitalism is, as a system, defining the modern world economically, is a system whereby the surplus is pumped out of the direct producer by occult means, by hidden means. Look, if you've got a lord on a manor in the Middle Ages and the peasant is working in the fields, and the lord turns up every now and then and says, "I'll take half the crop," it's pretty clear how the ruling class is managing to feed itself from the work of the working class.
Right. Right.
In capitalism, it isn't clear. In fact, it's hidden. The wage contract, in every day and every way, subtracts a surplus from the direct producer and puts it into the pocket of a group of people who consider themselves owners. Now, that's a remarkable system. And that's what the old man in the British Museum was talking about. He was talking about the depredations of capitalism as a system, which is what the Pope was talking about. And that's why Rush was right when he said the Pope is speaking Marxism. Okay?
In that respect, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I find myself offended when I hear what I call Democrats who are very, maybe they're liberal, but again, they're neoliberal, and I'll hear them referring to leftist, and the left believes this and the left believes that, and I'm like, no, that's not going, but anyway.
Let's take up Ron's challenge for a minute here and say, when we use terms like this, specify what we mean by it.
Right.
The term left is at least as ambiguous in this regard in usage as any others. Okay, I suggested when we say Marxism, we mean the analysis of capitalism. When we say left, I suggest we mean democratic. And when we mean right, when we say right, we mean anti-democratic. Now remember, our terms left and right come from the seating arrangement in the French National Assembly in 1793, where the more advanced revolutionaries sat on the left side of the chamber. In fact, it was stage left, as we actors would say, but in any case. And the more conservatives, the one who were pressing for the retention of the monarchy and so forth, sat on the right of the room. Left and right became political terms meaning more democratic, less democratic. Okay? Now, once you use that as your division point, then you have to say, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about political arrangements, or are we talking about economic arrangements? Remember that capitalism and democracy are contradictories. They're opposed to one another. Democracy means one person, one vote, and its fundamental notion. Capitalism means your votes depend upon how many dollars you hold.
Right.
$1, one vote.
$1, one vote, exactly. And
Okay.
But once you realize that, then you say, wait a minute, capitalism and democracy are opposed. And in fact, what socialism is in its fundamental sense is an insistence that the economy be run democratically. That is, one person, one vote on the running of the economy, not $1, one vote, as Ron just said. Okay, so we're talking about the left. We notice a couple of things. We notice, for example, that the Marxist-Leninist regimes of the 20th century are not left-wing movements at all under this definition, because they weren't democratic. They were specifically anti-democratic. In theory and in practice. They were right-wing movements. Now, this distinction allows us to begin to speak a little more accurately about what we mean by left and right when we begin talking about such right-wing formations as the Democratic Party of the United States.
Oh, well, the Vanguard Party, that kind of stuff.
Yes, exactly. Well, a Vanguard Party and the left are contradictories, but because of the Cold War, we have a confusing tradition of speaking of the Vanguard parties, the Leninist parties, and so forth as being somehow on the left. And that's simply a mistake.
Yeah.
You can't do that.
I just have to protest from time to time about this confusion that has arisen when you're talking about liberalism. You seem to be referring back to the 19th century meaning of laissez-faire and no government interference and so on.
But you see, that's what neoliberalism is.
Yes.
Neoliberalism is precisely a reassertion of laissez-faire in the 19th century sense, you know, at beginning and 40 years ago. I mean, neoliberalism, neo meaning new liberalism, is opposed to that liberalism which meant in the generation after the Second World War, ameliorative approach to capitalism. If you spoke of someone as spoke of Hubert Humphrey as a liberal in 1960s America, you meant someone who wanted to take the harsh edges off of capitalism, the harsh edges that were reducing people, and provide social supports of one form or another. Neoliberalism is precisely an attack on those social supports and a assertion of the rights of property, the dollar votes you were talking about, over against those concessions that had to be made after the Second World War to the populace at large. So, in that sense,
that's good. I mean, I think that this is very important, and I think needs to be explained because Ron's right. I see it on CNN, I see it on MSNBC. The terms being thrown around so loosely, liberal and leftist, and it's like, you know, a neoliberal. I didn't know what neoliberalism was. I thought that was
most people don't.
Yeah, I mean, until fairly recently, within the last 2 years, 3 years, something like that. So, yeah.
Yeah.
You produced a provocative list, Ron. Not to,
Yes.
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised about it at all.
Hold on to that list. We might want to continue discussing it in future programs, even if it isn't pre-Christmas.
This is the Ho Ho Hat Boys description of who's naughty and nice that we're considering, and you're watching news from Neptune on UPTV.
So let's have your nominations. Karen?
Well, I don't have a nomination for that. I think I misread some of what we were supposed to do.
No,
so I
not
simply,
at all.
Okay. Well, I went to one of the book reviews that I thought was related to books that the New York Times New York Times book reviews had promoted, and picked a writer who does book reviews that I happen to think highly of, and I've quoted him on here a couple times, and that's Pankaj Mishra. And he is referring to 3 books here. I mean, the article is The Explosive Transformation, and this was written in April of this year. And he refers to How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia by Mohsen Hamid, 5-Star Billionaire by Tash Awa, and Baker's Feast by Randy Boyagoda. And he begins this article with, "Let some people get rich first." That's what the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping proclaimed a generation ago, excuse me, inaugurating a strange new phase in his country's and the world's history. It now seems clear that nowhere has capitalism's promise to create wealth been affirmed more forcefully than in post-World War II Asia. By now we have all heard about the rise of China and India as economic powers. But as early as the late 1960s, the rates of economic growth in South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and even Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia were double the rate in European and American countries. In most of these nations, collaborations between the military or authoritarian-minded governments and businessmen ensured the rise of big, often monopoly conglomerates such as the South Korean chaebols. Most ordinary people suffered from a long denial of democracy, and then, following free elections, the subversion of democratic institutions. After decades of uneven economic growth, they now try to cope with the irreversible contamination of air, soil, and water. Long working hours, low wages, limited mobility, and perennial job insecurity are the lot of most toilers in Asian economies, especially women. Nevertheless, some people have gotten extremely rich in Asia's own golden age. Now, he goes on to discuss and to somewhat compare with some of our writers and their billionaires, etc. And he refers to the fact that some of these billionaires, for instance, Li Ka-shing, who is today's Asia's richest man with an estimated wealth of 31 billion. He lives in Hong Kong. He's actually what's known as a Taichu, not a Cantonese, from China. And of course, they have all these morality tales related to his hard work, how he was poor, worked his way up. But there's no denying, and I know this for certain, is what they know is what's known as the Bamboo Network. That's of overseas Chinese businessmen, which is the greatest Asian economic power outside of Japan. And how there is an Asian network whereby individuals will be supported by family, by close friends, by their former classmates and community in doing business, as long as it's for business purposes, and whereby they can then be successful without going to the banks and taking out bank loans. Now, I say this even though I know that it was in Thailand in 1973, after they had their first revolution against their military dictatorship, that progress began to take place. And according to what I was told at the time, right or wrongly, was that it's because the Bangkok Bank was then able to make loans to small Chinese entrepreneurs, small Chinese business people, like, quite frankly, my ex-husband, who came from poverty. I mean, these were Chinese immigrants. They would save their money in shoe boxes to educate their children, and they really struggled, and they lived in really highly impoverished conditions. But they appeared to become rich overnight based upon the fact that they not only had their networks, their familial and classmate networks, which literally share the proceeds, but they also were able to get these bank loans, which also brought about the crash in 1997, where many of them ended up impoverished, okay, except the big conglomerates who were able to, most of them survive. I'm going to go on now with what he has said here. I cannot do justice to the writing of Mishra, so therefore I have to read what he has said. He's an eloquent writer. What is new is the growing literary assessment of the ideology and practice of Asian capitalism. In Sea of Poppies and River of Smoke, the first two volumes of a projected trilogy of novels, Amitav Ghosh panoramically depicts the arrival in Asia of Western-style capitalism on the back of gunboats and indentured labor. Three new novels, then he refers to, that are set in contemporary Asia, the three that I've just mentioned, examine the deeper perils and fantasies of an economic system that Asians themselves deem mandatory across continent. He goes into detail, some of the details about these books and these novels, comparing them to some of our Western writers. One is Sinclair Lewis, who I highly revere, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, whom I don't, which...
I'll speak up for F when we have a chance.
Well, no, I'll give my reason why. I mean, I thought he was, of course, he wrote beautifully, but I found myself, even at a very young age, before I was in any way politically aware, I found myself disturbed at having to spend time reading about people who were what I considered frivolous and decadent. And I'm just not into what I call the
Probably
personal
a problem
and
with
the
Shakespeare,
private.
too, then, didn't you?
Well, yeah, except I never really read Shakespeare, so that could be a problem, yeah. Other than Merchant of Venice is the only one I'm really familiar with, which there's stories about that, too, and why that one was assigned. But at any rate, when he, and I'll get on to this later regarding this, he says, in our own time, the cash nexus has seemed deeply absorbed into cultures throughout the world. Apparently unalterable and ever-present, the ruthless mechanisms and built-in injustices of capitalism no longer provoke the same degree of shock, revulsion, or fear among writers. It isn't just that capitalism, which had lost much moral legitimacy between the two world wars, was exalted by default in the post-1945 era in comparison with its illiberal, inept, and now defunct ideological rival communism, or that it now underwrites the existence of many literary novelists. Literature on the whole has grown more private and less concerned with larger socioeconomic processes, which are also harder to identify. So, which is my point, more private and less concerned with larger socioeconomic processes, which you certainly deal with, and yet you can appreciate Fitzgerald.
Sounds like what we were talking about with the
Right.
media, doesn't
Well,
it?
that's my
Yeah.
point. That's exactly my point, and why further discussion related to these books, which support Mishra with the private and the personal. Why I'm not interested in reading those books. I'm only interested in reading Mishra's book. He goes on to say, capitalist society no longer clearly resembles, as it did to Balzac, a jungle populated entirely by fools and knaves. The bourgeois civilization created by capitalism has helped mask crude ambition, overt aggressiveness, and vulgar ostentation. The exceptions, such as, you like this, Donald Trump and Sheldon Adelson. I don't know who Sheldon Adelson is, but I know who Donald Trump is.
Well, Adelson was the guy who contributed so much, the casino king, who contributed so
Okay.
much money to the
he's-
Republican and
When he's-
Israeli causes.
Right.
Gambling magnate.
So,
Right.
so when he refers to them as exceptions, I'm like, what? And then he says they're throwbacks to a more garish era, prove irony to be the dominant mode of our own age. Egalitarianism in dress and manners softens class divisions. Why does everybody wear blue jeans today, whether you're rich or whether you're poor? It's to give the impression that we're all equal, right? I've had this question asked by Asians as to why do Americans dress so sloppy? Okay, even for formal occasions. And I always said, well, it's convenience, it's efficiency. But now I realize, no, it's actually a disguise.
Yeah.
So
I think there's something to that.
egalitarianism in dress and manners softens class divisions and big capitalists, while increasingly philanthropic also appear to promote, through social media networks, ideas of community and cooperation. So the financial collapse of 2008 and the general sense of crisis since in the West may now yield more novels like, and he refers to Zadie Smith's N.W., which I have no idea what that is, alert to the cruel inequalities of income and opportunity opened up by the boom years of global capitalism, the loss of fellow feeling, and the spiritual hollowness that can oppress even those relatively affluent and privileged. Then he mentions Aravind Adiga's The White Tiger and Yu Hua's Brothers. They satirically evoke the vast amoral landscapes of India and China through which contemporary entrepreneurs make their way. And then he goes into more detail about these various different books. What I find important is where he says, still little understood, this migration, and he's referring to the migration, the world's largest of hundreds of millions to cities that cannot accommodate them, has sown political and economic turmoil across Asia. From fundamentalisms and revolutions in the Muslim world to intensifying violence against women in India and dizzying economic growth in coastal China. This is about Hamid's book. Hamid calls it an explosive transformation, the support of stifling, stabilizing bonds of extended relationships, weakening and giving way, leaving in their wake insecurity, anxiety, productivity, and potential. One of the things we have to recognize, and I think we saw it happening in the 50s, when America became, as individuals, as families, when people began to move, and we became less, what is the word I want to use, less committed to our friends and our community as we traversed the United States. Yeah. But in Asia, this is very dire. In China, for instance, you have the rural poor flocking into the cities where they have work. They will still always go back home because their culture demands that they be where the ancestors were buried most of the time. But you'll see this in Thailand. One of the reasons Thailand, I believe, is having the revolt and the problems that they're having today is because over the years, decades that I lived there were always the rural poor leaving the farms, leaving agriculture, because they had to go, and it was usually the men, getting jobs, driving taxis, or working construction, or the women coming and working as housemaids. And then eventually many of them would go into the factories. But what it does is it completely disperses the families, it disperses the community. And they lose those ties that really had, the ties that bind so strongly. Yeah. And the devastation that this has wreaked, but I think this is also why you have such an uprising now. So I'll try to make this a little quicker, but basically highly motivated as these Asian protagonists are in the books that he's referring to. He says, one immediately notices their difference from their 19th century counterparts in the West. Serene self-confidence as well as commercial elan defines the elders of the merchant family in Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks. Even in the inspirational Horatio Alger novels, old-fashioned virtues of good character rather than hard-nosed scheming are upheld as the right path to personal fortune. But ambitious Asian provincials in the early 21st century enter a world already substantially shaped by modern industrial capitalism in which mass production, mass distribution, and mass consumption are the norm. Human relationships are mostly impersonal, even anonymous, and transactional, and few people really believe in the fairness of the competitive market economy or its ability to furnish billions of Asians with the consumerist lifestyles enjoyed so far by a minority of Europeans and Americans. Innovation and originality don't take you very far, and indeed there are few rags to riches stories coming out of India where old established business families and active investors in property development, construction, and mining dominates the economy. Sorry, now I have to... I'm not very techy. I managed to get my printer's ink in to print this out, but I managed to mess up the second last page.
Our
here.
time is short. Why don't we see if we
Okay.
can... Ron, you got a reaction to what we've heard so far? I think
Yeah,
this is important stuff.
it sounds like something that we should be very familiar with, the tendency
Yes.
of free market capitalism to erode and ultimately
Right.
to destroy every other institution,
Right.
including itself ultimately, but
Yes.
starting with the family. There's nothing left but the naked cash nexus,
Yeah.
and it's textbook economics in this country, Samuelson, for example, that everything has a price, every good and every service, and that rules over everything. Your fundamental job in life is to grab as much as you can for yourself, and as an afterthought maybe, well, your family too, and to do it legally.
And that's your excuse for doing everything usually as well for the family and survival. And you're quite right, because even the last paragraph here, he describes how people who don't have the education or the skills or the opportunities to go to the cities are left back on the farms where there's nothing left. And his last sentence here is that, though largely mute in these dramas of Asian capitalism, the future really belongs to this invisible majority of the filthy poor, people who can't even try to enlarge their limits of possibility, but retain the silent potential of weeds that can overrun the world's most zealously maintained gardens. And I thought about it because he's referring to the people left behind with no opportunity, and I thought, aren't we seeing that here in the U.S. today with the fact that I just saw it on headlines this morning somewhere on something whereby the people who have been out of work for any long period of time have no opportunities to go back to work. I mean, this is really pathetic. So what I see happening in India, maybe not quite the impoverishment, or in China or Thailand or elsewhere amongst the poor, I see it happening today in the U.S. the same way.
Yeah, there's this paradoxical phenomenon of companies, corporations refusing to hire people who are unemployed.
Right.
They want to get those who are
Yep.
already employed somewhere else.
Exactly.
There's a terrific
Right.
prejudice against people who've
Yeah.
been unemployed, particularly for any length of time.
There's a phrase there, I think, Ron, that needs to be glossed in the way you're suggesting these terms that we've been using about politics and economics need attention, and that's free market capitalism.
Oh, yeah.
Remember, free market capitalism is precisely, as a description of our current system, is precisely a system in which there are no, or very few, free markets. Markets are carefully controlled by the leading economic interests. The careful attention to market share, the careful attention to what can go into the market and what can't, enforced by government regulations when necessary. This is what the libertarians get upset about, but more often enforced simply by the control of the economy that the largest players already have. Means that you don't have anything that approaches the sort of textbook notion of a free market where essentially independent capitalists enter into the market with independent workers all roughly the same size and the same degree of wealth. That's not how it works. The capitalism that is burgeoning throughout Asia that Karen has been describing is a controlled capitalism, a controlled market capitalism, in which, yes, markets exist and exchanges exist, but those markets are in no sense free. You're watching Aware from the Air. Let's do this right. Yeah. Last show of the year. You're watching News from Neptune, and owing to the indulgence of the UPTV staff, we will be back next week for another program.
Yeah, what publication was that from, Karen?
Okay, this is from the New York Book Review of Books, I think.
Oh,
Asia,
okay.
The Explosive Transformation by Pankra Mishra.
Yeah, okay, that's what the font looked like. I think
Yeah.
the first time you said New York Times Book Review.
Well, I just know it's what Carl
It's the New York
posted.
Review of Books, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry, yeah.
It was, there are a number of articles of the New York Review, a very questionable publication itself, I must say. The days in which the New York Review really did represent a left publication, those are about 50 years old now, and it's quite conventionally liberal, and another usage of the term these days. What Karen was selecting this article from was a collection of year-end articles that they were recommending.
By Mishra.
Final comments, Ron, on the Asian scene. I have just one, which is if you're looking for an American novel which which raises some of the questions that Karen was suggesting weren't being raised so much by these Asian examples, recommend Thomas Pynchon's Bleeding Edge. Pynchon is unusual. He's hardly typical of anyone, but the combination of economic, personal, and what can only be called fantastical writing finds, to my sense, no better representative than Thomas Pynchon, and his new novel is called Bleeding Edge. I recommend it. It's set at the time of 9/11 and the dot-com bust, and has as much to do with capitalism and technology as it has to do with individual characters and politics. It's quite a piece of work.
Okay, I wasn't expecting the Spanish Inquisition, Carl.
Concluding point.
No, I think we're running over time here. So.
You have been watching News from Neptune, not that other program that I happen to mention. And we're going to, we'll get the Spanish Inquisition in a later program? Okay.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Okay, good.
Well, no.
This has been News from Neptune for the 51st week of 2013, the Winter's Eve edition. It's going to get very cold, and we should be ready for it. If our program interested you, you might want to look for similar programs here at Urbana Public Television, now not only on cable, but streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight on News from Neptune have been Ron Szoke and Karen Aram. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and see our Facebook page as well. I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, a happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night.